No, this is not a tutorial on how to art and how to clip studio paint. I've only been in the drawing game for like 4 years and used clip studio for like 2, so I'd recommend watching official and professional tutorials by some extremely talented people. There's a lot of them out there and I'm pretty sure you'll find some. I'll basically go over my workflow and what I can do and what you could do. So for starters, I'll go over some illustration basics, the comic features, and the animation options. Every step will be highlighted in the timeline, and if you're looking for something specific, just skip to that part. So I don't want to hold you back any longer. This is basically Clip Studio Paint. Now, going through every single feature is not the point of this video, and I will assume that you have a basic understanding of Clip Studio and drawing overall. Like I said, this is only a showcase of my habits, and it's best if I just walk you through my workspace first. Now, I pulled up this illustration so I can show what the single windows can do. Over here we have the command bar. Here are all the commands that you have actually in those little tabs over here. There are too many and most of those I don't even use, so this is pretty much a sum up of everything I actually do use. Of course, we have the create a new file, open a file, save a file, close a window, import things like images, movies, even vectors. And there's a cool feature that you can import patterns from an image. I actually do use this a lot when I have like a patterned background. I just pulled up this one and it creates like a pattern. You can just use like a blending mode over here, and it'll be like a cool background. Of course, you have multiple export options. I mostly use export in JPEG and PNG for animations, image sequence, movie, and animated GIF. There is a cool feature called the time lapse. You can record it and basically look at your process again. The usual undo and redo button, copy, paste, cut, change canvas sizes and resolution, the transformation tools. I mostly use the mesh transformation to be more precise, but it's depending on what action you want to use. You can flip horizontally and vertically. If you have an image, you can just flip this one. And it doesn't flip the view, it flips the image. Then we have here some animation features that I will get into later. And here you actually have the view settings and flip the canvas without affecting the actual drawing. And lastly, the filters like the Gaussian blur, the mosaic, and the Perlin noise. Those are basically all the filters that I actually use. And that's everything summed up from here. Next up, we have the tools. They're pretty much the same like in every editing software. You can zoom in and zoom out, move the canvas, not what's actually on the layers. Here you actually do move what's on the layers. Operation, this is actually useful for keyframing and vector layers. Like here I have a vector and I could actually change a lot of things about it, like the color, the brush size, and even the brush shape. Then we have the auto selection. It basically selects everything that's shown on the canvas in a computer generated way here or here, and you can even decide if you want to have it on the editing layer. That way only that on the editing layer will be selected. The selection area, the usual, the eyedrop, the different pens, the markers, pastel, the watercolors, the airbrush. I don't actually use this one. The eraser. Now for the eraser, I actually either use the eraser or the transparency color. Depends on what brush you have. That way it adapts the actual features of the brush. Decorations, really fun thing to use if you want to save some time. I don't use it because I go from a natural look. The blending tool, the liquify. If I'm not sure if I want to keep some proportions, I can actually just change them here. I can just play around. If I want to increase what's shown on the layer or decrease, you have so many options here. If you just want to move something, the gradient, you have some presets here, of course, and for example the rainbow. Or if you want to erase something but in a gradient way, you can actually use the gradient eraser, which is something I often use. And you can even create your own gradients. The fill bucket, you just have to experiment with the values because sometimes it depends on the picture how much will be actually filled in. The shapes, don't really use those. I sometimes do those for sketches, but not really. The frames, this will become more useful for comics. Text, the usual. Correction line. Now, if you do have a line, you can basically decide the thickness of it in certain areas. You just have to draw on it and select the areas. You can thicken it, narrow it. These are basically the two options I use. You can change the brush size, everything. The subtool here basically shows you different variations of a tool. Like for example, if I have a pen, I have like other pens. If I have an eraser, I have different erasers. With tool property, you'll be basically able to adjust the values of a tool, like brush size or brush density or opacity. And subtool detail is basically an extended version of tool property, but these are basically hidden, so you have to enable those. The color wheel, of course, is pretty basic. Then of course the color slider, I don't use it exactly, but if I want to have like a specific color in a mathematical way, like for example the most red or like the most magenta. With color set, this becomes useful when you have like color palettes, so I don't have to use the eyedropper on a different file. I just can select those colors here and use them. And you have a variety of other color sets with the rainbow tool. Color history can become useful if you are just randomly mixing colors and suddenly you remembered, what was the color that I mixed again? You can just go back to this one. The subview, now here you can import images and eyedrop the color directly from that image without actually switching to a new file. I only use it for this specific image, but probably should use the color set for that one. It's kind of become a bad habit. Auto action introduces something that blew my mind. You basically record your process, and after you recorded it, you can just play it. I use this one if I have like a lot of frames on an animation and I want to blur every single frame. I can just press play and go through all of the frames. Now I have to select each frame and I just go with a shortcut to go frame by frame, but you can just press play instead of going to filter, select the blur, select the value and so on. So this is much faster. And you can also download some sets like the chromatic aberration, which surprisingly Clip Studio doesn't have. So I downloaded it and can just press play. Have to press 2 times OK, and there we have like a chromatic aberration. The material, you have those monochromatic patterns like some noises, some color patterns, and one of my favorites, the 3D models. You can basically drag and drop a character and play around with it. You can even customize the character, like how big he should be, what kind of body they should have, if they're more muscular or more plus sized, or if they're more slim. It really depends on you. So this makes up for a really good reference. Now over here you have the layers. Layers, of course, what they're used to. I'm assuming you know how to create one, the vector layers, the folders, the masks. Blending modes, you can just play around with those. If you want to have like a specific color to organize your layers, here we have it. Now layer property, you can basically add more things to a layer, like adding a border effect over here if you want to have like a different color, or you want to change the tone with a pattern. Even the pattern can be changed with the frequency. Or if you want to change the layer color, you can also use this here. The layer color is the darkest color and the white are the lightest colors. So these are all the layer properties. Lastly, we have the timeline, but I will get into that later when it's relevant for animation. Basically, I've become used to having everything drawing related and tool related on my left side, and everything like layers and organization, it's on my right side. And the timeline in the middle for a more broader spectrum, so I can work with the animations and the frames. Alright, now that we're a bit familiar with our workspace, first we create a new file. You have some presets over here, like 4K. I've created my own presets, like mostly 16:9 ratios, but in high qualities, and a 4K to 5K resolution. Sometimes I flip those, sometimes I create just 4K to 4K for a square canvas. It's really up to you. But the paper color, I usually go for more of a grayish color, so it's not too saturated or too bright. And there we go. Now before we want to start drawing anything, depending on what you want to do, there's a cool feature, the time lapse that I showed earlier. If you record a time lapse, if you do something quickly, you can basically record that and export it in some different ways. If it's something longer, you can decide if you want to keep all the time or if you want to have it sped up. The sizes, of course, the ratio. I keep the original ratio and then you're good to go. You select then a location to save it and you can post it. That's what I do. I'm saying this because I forgot to do that for what's coming next. So the next 2 drawings will be sped up to keep it sweet and simple, but I'll let you know what my thoughts were. I'll start my process by going through Pinterest or any other social media platform to gather references and inspiration for the sketch. The more the better, since I don't want to copy, but to interpret instead. I took an element of each reference to make something new. In my case, I even took something from my life, like the LASIK eye surgery from last November, with my main motivation being the eyes. I make a separate layer folder and scale them down a bit. With the liquify tool, I would occasionally adjust certain elements, like the size of the eye here. Sometimes I would even flip the canvas to check if the proportions and the perspectives are okay. I forget this sometimes though. Now, once we have the sketch, for the more cartoony style, we will be making a line art. Here I would create a vector layer for more control over the strokes. In operation, you can adjust those values afterwards. I like to play around with the thickness of lines for more contrast. Some prefer a cleaner and thinner line art, some completely thick. I like to keep things in the middle. You can definitely add more afterwards, like I did. Once that is done, I fill in the base colors. I either use the fill tool or the selection tool, or a combination of both. Firstly, I'll add a grayish base for the character, then add the different colors. And there we go. Next, I added a simple background and put a lightened layer on top of the base to determine more of an aesthetic by having a purple-yellow contrast, since those are the complementary colors. Now I would add the shades and highlights. When you shade, it's best if you use a separate layer and draw over it, either with a selection tool, mask tool, or by clipping. I usually use clipping, but it depends if you want to have more control over your shadows. There you better use the mask tool. The color should definitely not be pure black, since the blending modes will do the trick. The best modes for shadows are either multiply, overlay, or hard light. I mostly go for a more saturated color. Realistically, go for a grayish tone, but aesthetically I would prefer more of a popping color. Here I have a popping purple. You need a light source, in this case the bottom. I usually shade the whole layer and then erase all of the parts where light would hit the surface. Most people do it the other way around, but I've become used to it, so it got into my workflow. For the highlights, I use a lighter color. Here I have a lighter yellow. My blending mode options here are Add Glow, Overlay, Glow Dodge, one of my favorites, and Soft Light. I either draw little dots as indicators for highlights, or create a gradient to showcase a vague light source. I did the latter. The eyes here should glow, so I created like little catching arms for more of a spooky effect. Needed a few tries to get those because I didn't exactly know what I wanted to create, so that ended up happening. Usually I would have Add Glow, but in this case I tried Hard Mix, which worked surprisingly well. Lastly, I added a blurred version on top and decided on Color Burn as a mode. To have more of a coherent color palette, I added a gradient map with a transition from purple to red to yellow, noise texture for a fuzzy feeling, and a signature. And here we're done with a cartoony graphic illustration. I still haven't mastered the realistic or semi-realistic style yet, so that's why I thought I'd do a simple study of one image and add the colors of another one. It's a bit of a challenge for myself because erasing on a study is usually a no-go, which makes it a lot more exciting. It's a whole process, nothing calculated, and feels more like spontaneous art. I started by sketching the rough anatomy and adding some smaller details, so I don't have to look at the reference again. With black and white, it's a lot easier since you only have to consider where the light hits the surface and leaves the shadow. Hues are completely irrelevant here. So now that we have the rough sketch, I go over it with a softer brush. I use a marker that I downloaded for this one, the Dreamy marker, and I focus more on the bigger shapes and slowly get into more detail. It's best if you keep the same level of detail for everything. Like if you start with the hair, do all the hair at the same time. Or when you do the eyes, do both eyes at the same time with the same process. At some point, all of the colors were color blocked. That's why I started eyedropping all of the colors in between and going more into detail and mixing and blending, and that's basically all of the process. I did say that erasing was a no-go, but since the rough sketch was a bit too rough, I had to erase the edges and make it a lot more smooth. But overall, when it comes to painting, you don't erase your mistakes, you just draw over them basically. So when that's done, this time I want to have the colors similar to a different reference to mix it up. Here I use a gradient map which determines the colors for me in a spectrum that I chose. I go for the warmer colors first and added a second layer with the cold colors above. I make a mask so only one side of the body has the cold colors. And lastly, I do the same thing just like the other drawing. Add some filters and blending modes, color burn, as well as noise texture. And here we go. A finished study recreated with another image. For exporting single layer images as in illustrations, there are different options available. You can save the whole project as a Photoshop document or a Photoshop big document if the project is a lot bigger and more complex. And both of these you can open on different programs, since Photoshop is a lot more compatible than Clip Studio Paint. They both are very similar in use, but not entirely the same. So you have to keep in mind that the layers will not always be the same. For image files, you can use PNG and JPEG. The other ones I really haven't used. So if you have a transparent background for like smaller designs, like stickers maybe, and you want to have like a looseless quality, I would suggest a PNG. That's like the highest quality, especially if you have like sharp designs and sharp edges and icons. However, for more painted stuff or even textures like noise, I would use JPEG because they take up a lot of pixels and each pixel has to be calculated. That way the image size increases highly. I would also use those for posting since most images will be compressed either way. You can even control the image size and how many kilobytes it would take to export that image. Like now it would be 10 megabytes with 100% quality. If we decrease it to 50, it would be like 1.2 megabytes. Of course, you can use a PNG if you want, but the size will be enormous and it's up to you if you can handle that much space and for what you want to use it. PNG is for more graphic illustrations and a JPEG more for painted and textured illustrations. So in our case, we have the Cartoony drawing without the noise texture that I disabled. It would be able to be exported as a PNG, but for this texturized illustration, I would use a JPEG. For comics, or webcomics in this case, we have to keep a lot more in mind when it comes to the canvas. I'll use my comic series as an example. I have comic pages in case you want to print them out one day, but also a scrollable webtoon. If you do both, it's best if you started with the comic pages to convert them into a webtoon later. In the file settings, a lot more options are available. This one is the default, but if you want to have more options, you select this one. I don't actually use this one because I'm all set with the default one, so we'll keep working with this one. The first thing you'll notice are the guidelines. The ones inside in the blue area here is mostly space for the main content and text. The one in the middle with the green canvas is the definite border. I wouldn't write any text on it, but I would still use an extended version of the illustration or panels. The last line, the red line, is like a safe border which will be useful for printing since it won't print everything 100%. So if something cuts away, the red border is like the safe that gets cut away. With this example of a page, I'll show you my routine routine. I usually start by sketching out the page. I advise to keep perspectives, character positions, and detail in mind. It depends how used you are, but the more detailed the sketch is, the better for later. You don't want to lose too much time with sketching though, but use as much as needed for you to make good use of the sketch. Afterwards, I change the layer color to more of a bluish tone and change the opacity so I can just draw over it. Now we go on with creating borders. I usually create like a big one first, and with a cut frame border tool, I just cut the frames accordingly to the sketch. You can even customize your border in the operations tool, like what color do they have, do you even want a border, should it snap, what brush size do you want to use, what brush shape, everything can be adjusted here. Before you cut the borders though, it's best to keep in mind the gutters. Now the gutters is basically the space between each panel. You can adjust the values here for vertical and horizontal gutters. I have it at 50 for both horizontal and vertical, and then you can just cut away. It's pretty simple to use and saves a lot of time. You can actually go crazy with this one. And right here we have the finished frame borders. I added a black background because this is like the default for this particular scene, and the frames are in white to have that contrast. Each panel will have like a mask around the panels. Now everything you draw outside the panel won't be shown, but if it's too distracting to have this blue surface, you can disable this one. Over here to enable mask and show mask area, and only disable the mask area. Inside I usually create a folder with the characters and the backgrounds. Then I go on with inking, aka the line art. With the color sets, it's a lot easier to color in. Depending on your style, you can basically go nuts here. Once you have drawn everything, you can go on with enhancements like text. I created my own font, which I highly suggest doing. It adds some flavor and personality to your comic without having like a basic font. And with vector layers, you can create some unique speech bubbles in your style and just erase the lines sticking out. With this comic though, I usually do like a blob of color and leave it at that. So here I just add the text, here's like the speech bubble, and some enhancements, like here he's looking a bit surprised, some sound effects. Do your own thing and create your own story with it basically. And there we go with the comic page. Now you just gotta repeat this process like 100 times for a whole complete comic series. I still have to try this out, but it might be better if you start with doing a bunch of sketch pages first, then inking all pages and coloring all pages and so forth. It might save your sanity since it seems like more of a progress and it actually keeps you more connected with the chronology of the story. So now we can actually export the pages as a single layer. I usually go for PNG, but even a JPEG is fine. The whole rules for illustrations apply here as well. Textures go for JPEG, simple, and graphic go for PNG. Now if you have a bunch of pages ready and you want to create like a Webtoon version of it. Here I have 4 pages in one roll. You can do that here easily. There is a story creator, which is like a Webtoon creation type of deal, but I have no idea what it does. Instead, I just create a long canvas. The maximum is like 50,000 pixels, so keep that in mind. The width should be somewhat a bit smaller than the original page. You can check that by going to change canvas size and go to pixels. Then you have the exact measurements. For the Webtoon, you just go with something a lot smaller, like 2400 times how long you need it to be. The cool thing is that now that you have your panels, you can basically downscale them to what size you need them to be. So what I do first is basically copy paste all the pages and their panels inside and basically move them around as you like. Like for example here, I still have the text separate to the panels, so you would have to move them separately. I made like a small Webtoon reader, so I can basically calculate how much I see in one screen. I usually don't use rulers, but in this case it was very useful. If you press shift, you can basically scroll down with it in that exact line and see how much you would actually see in like one page and see how much distance you need between all of the panels individually. No worries if you have a lot of space left. You can still crop it at the end like I did. I had 500,000, but I shortened it to 34,000. Keep in mind though that the panels need enough space for scrolling. Now we can actually export this page too, of course without the Webtoon reader. Same story if you want to have PNG or JPEG. There is a cool site that lets you crop your pages according to Tapas and Webtoon guidelines, since they're a bit picky when it comes to uploading images. They basically scale down the image to the optimal resolution and crop it into multiple images with the optimal ratios. Then they are ready to be uploaded. And lastly, let's dive into animation. There is a template for animations, and I advise you to use those for bigger projects. You can customize your canvas size, resolution, even frame rate, and how many frames you want to have, and the blank space. That will be the space not captured by the border and mostly for your help when you have to draw something outside the frame. If you start out with an illustration canvas, you can simply go to Create New Timeline over here at the bottom, and you'll have the same settings as well with frame rate and playback time. Only that the little story guideline here and the blank space will be missing, which I haven't really figured out why it's not added and how to actually add. I never figured it out. Now that you have a timeline, you have to create a 2D camera. I have my shortcut here to create a new 2D camera folder, and keep in mind it will always be the ratio of the canvas size and it cannot be changed. I advise putting everything inside of it at the end of the process to avoid lagginess. Animation here works a bit different because you have animation folders, which means that every frame, aka the cells here, will be as layers in the animation folders. The onion skin is always advised when you're drawing in between frames. The cool thing is that you have the same workflow as drawing an illustration, but only now you have the layers as the folders with a timeline. Each cell has a name and can be added to the timeline by right-clicking and clicking on the list of cells. I'll walk you through one of my projects, which was my first full tile sequence, to give you a better picture. I start here with the storyboards, which are simple images that later turn into an animatic. Some animatic scenes are more detailed than others, but overall they work as main poses for later. For full scenes, I actually create one file for each scene since it takes a lot of performance power. I'll focus on the first scene here. Usually I would do line art next. I would add new folders to put in the animation folders, so each body part and effect is separate. It's not always necessary, especially in this scene, because I don't have any characters here. In this scene where I do have a character, I only have one animation folder for the line art here, highlighted in red, but usually I would create multiple folders with animation folders for each body part. As you can see here, I've added vector layers inside of the animation folders, so I have more control over the lines with the operation tool. I start drawing the main poses first from the animatic and add in between frames step by step. Here you can see it with the onion skin. Once that is done, I copy paste the line art folders and erase what's on the canvas of each cell. That way I don't have to rearrange the frames for the base colors, and I fill in with the fill bucket each color at a time. Just like an illustration, I would also add blending modes as effects that can be animated as well. For those I would use keyframes. Speaking of, once all your animations are done, you can add keyframes here for more movement. Every single object is able to be transformed with the operation tool, including the 2D camera. For example, here I have the back, where I've enabled keyframes on this layer, where I slightly move the objects to have more of a perspective. Here down below you can change the keyframe interpolation, which changes the speed how they should be played, and with the operation tool you can basically change the position, scale ratio, rotation, and the layer opacity. You just need to right click on the frame and add the keyframe, or add like this little diamond over here. It will do the same thing. Then you go to the next frame and also add a diamond or add a keyframe, and this little diamond will appear. The diamond will be green if you add like a linear interpolation, but it will be a different color with hold and smooth. Yellow for hold and light blue for smooth. Now that the animation is done, it's time to export. We can either export as a GIF, movie, or image sequence. If it's something quick, just to see the results, I advise the first two. For more quality, I advise the latter, the image sequence. You can change the drawing area, how many frames you actually want to have exported, the frame rate, even the name can be changed, and what kind of image you want to have. I usually pick PNG. That will become handy if you want to work in After Effects with transparent objects and add effects, or just any other program you want to work with. Overall, this is how I create my animations. And this is basically Clip Paint. I think I really need a counter on how many times I said basically in this video. And I'm pretty sure I left out a lot of things that might be useful for others, but this should be everything useful to me, so maybe we have the same workflow and this works well for you too. I actually like giving away all my secrets, and who knows, I might do a follow-up or an improved version of this. I still have a lot to go, so maybe I'll learn a lot of new things and teach a lot of new things. In the meantime, I'll provide you with new projects. Got a lot cooking up, and it's thanks to this baby, so thank you for watching and see you around.